The knife slipped from Alira Voss's hand and clattered against the marble floor, echoing through the grand hall like a warning bell. Every head at the staff table turned toward her, and for one terrible second, she thought she had ruined everything before the wedding had even begun. "Pick it up and breathe," whispered Nora, the older server standing beside her, nudging her elbow. "You look like you have seen a ghost." Alira bent down, retrieved the knife, and forced her hands to stop shaking. She had taken this catering job for one reason only. Her grandmother, Margaret, needed medicine that cost more than Alira earned in a month, and this wedding, the biggest event the region had seen in a decade, paid triple the normal rate. She could not afford to lose it over nerves. The mansion where the wedding would take place belonged to the Ashcombe family, rulers of the entire Shadowpine territory. Alira had heard whispers about Alpha King Draven Ashcombe her whole life, the way people speak about storms they have never personally witnessed but fear all the same. He was said to be powerful beyond measure, cold in his decisions and utterly untouchable. Today he would marry Seraphine Cole, daughter of a rival council leader, in a ceremony meant to end years of conflict between two territories. Alira had no interest in kings or politics. She only wanted to carry trays, refill glasses, and disappear into the background until her shift ended and her pay arrived. The head caterer, a sharp woman named Priya, clapped her hands to gather the staff. "Listen carefully," she said. "Today is not an ordinary event. Every guest here holds power. Every mistake will be noticed. You smile, you serve, you vanish. Do you understand?" The staff nodded in unison. Alira nodded too, though her stomach twisted with unease she could not explain. They were led through a service corridor into the main hall, where decorators were placing the final touches on an arrangement of white flowers and silver ribbons. The room was vast, with ceilings so high they seemed to disappear into shadow, and windows so tall that morning light poured across the floor in long golden strips. Alira had never seen anything so beautiful, yet something about the atmosphere pressed against her chest, heavy and unfamiliar, like standing too close to a fire she couldn't see. She began setting silverware at the long guest tables, counting forks and knives under her breath to keep her mind steady. That was when she heard the doors open at the far end of the hall, and the room fell silent. He walked in without ceremony, without an entourage announcing his arrival, simply because he did not need one. Alpha King Draven Ashcombe moved like a man who had never once doubted his place in a room. He wore a dark formal coat, sharp against his pale skin, and his eyes swept over the hall with the practiced calm of someone assessing every exit and every threat before allowing himself to relax. Alira kept her head down, focused on the fork in her hand, refusing to be one of the many people staring at him, like he was a piece of art rather than a person. But then his footsteps stopped. She felt it before she understood it, a strange shift in the air, like the temperature in the room had dropped and risen at the same time. She looked up despite herself, and found him already looking at her. Draven Ashcombe, Alpha King of Shadowpine, stood frozen in the middle of his own wedding hall, staring at a server he had never met, as though he had seen something impossible. Alira's heart thudded once, hard, against her ribs. She quickly looked away, telling herself it meant nothing. Powerful men stared at people all the time. It was probably an accident, a trick of the light, nothing more. But when she dared to glance up again a moment later, he was still watching her, his jaw tight, his hands curled slightly at his sides as though restraining something. "Alira," Nora hissed under her breath, pulling her attention back to the table setting. "Do not stare at the Alpha King. Do you want to lose this job before the ceremony even starts?" "I wasn't staring," Alira whispered back, though her cheeks burned with the lie. Nora gave her a knowing look but said nothing more, and together they finished setting the tables in silence. An hour passed in a blur of preparation. Guests began arriving, dressed in colors so rich and fabrics so fine that Alira felt like an outsider peering into a world that was never meant to include her. She carried trays of refreshments, refilled water glasses, and adjusted flower arrangements whenever a decorator barked an order. She kept her eyes low and her movements quick, determined not to draw attention again. Yet no matter how careful she was, she could feel it, an awareness prickling along the back of her neck whenever the Alpha King passed through the hall. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself it was simply because everyone in the room felt the same pull toward a man of his standing, but deep down, some quiet part of her whispered that this was different. Near midday, she was sent to deliver a tray of drinks to a private sitting room reserved for close family members before the ceremony began. She balanced the tray carefully, weaving through the hallway lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and pushed open the door with her elbow. The room was empty except for one person. Draven stood by the window, his back to her, shoulders tense beneath his formal coat. He must have heard her enter, because he spoke without turning around. "Leave it on the table." His voice was low, controlled, yet something beneath it sounded strained, like a rope pulled too tight. Alira set the tray down quickly, eager to leave before her presence became a problem. "Wait." She froze, her hand still on the tray. Slowly, she turned to face him. He had turned as well, and now he studied her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through her, into memories she hadn't thought about in years. "Have we met before?" he asked quietly. Alira blinked, caught off guard. "No, Your Highness. I don't believe so." "You're certain?" "Yes," she said, though something small and uncertain flickered at the edge of her memory, a shape she couldn't quite grasp. "I would remember meeting someone like you." His lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he looked almost disappointed, as though he had hoped for a different answer. Then his expression shifted back into practiced composure, the mask of a king returning to its place. "You may go," he said. Alira nodded quickly and hurried out of the room, her pulse racing for reasons she could not explain. She told herself it was simply nerves, the pressure of being alone with someone so powerful. She told herself the strange tightening in her chest meant nothing at all. But as she walked back down the corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, something neither of them yet understood. By the time she returned to the main hall, the ceremony preparations had reached their final stage. Guests filled every seat, chatting in low, excited voices. Musicians tuned their instruments near the front of the hall. Somewhere beyond the doors, Seraphine Cole was being dressed in a gown that had taken months to design, preparing to become the next queen of Shadowpine. Alira resumed her duties, refilling glasses and adjusting chairs, trying to lose herself in the simple rhythm of work. Yet every so often, she felt eyes on her from across the room, and when she looked up, she found Draven watching her again. Even as council members spoke to him, even as attendants adjusted his coat, even as the entire wedding machinery moved around him like clockwork. It was as if he could not stop looking, no matter how hard he tried. Nora noticed it too. "Alira," she whispered urgently, pulling her aside near the kitchen doors. "The Alpha King keeps watching you. I've served at dozens of these events, and I have never seen anything like this." "I don't know why," Alira admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never met him before today." "Are you certain?" Nora studied her carefully. "Sometimes people forget faces from long ago, especially if they were young." Alira opened her mouth to deny it again, but something in Nora's words struck an unexpected chord. A memory stirred faintly at the back of her mind, distant and blurred, like sunlight through fog. A stranger, an injury, a quiet night long ago in her grandmother's small bakery. She shook her head, dismissing the thought before it could fully form. It was ridiculous. Alpha Kings did not wander into small bakeries unnoticed. Whatever connection Draven Ashcombe believed existed between them, it had to be a mistake. Yet even as she told herself this, she could not stop her eyes from drifting back toward him one more time, and she could not stop the strange warmth that spread through her chest when she found him already looking back. The wedding had not yet begun, and already, something ancient and unspoken had stirred awake in the grand hall of the Ashcombe estate. Something neither Alira nor Draven fully understood, but something too powerful to ignore. As the final guests took their seats and the doors at the back of the hall prepared to open for the bride's arrival, Alira felt a quiet certainty settle over her, one she could not explain and did not want to examine too closely. Whatever was happening between her and the Alpha King, it was only just beginning. The bride arrived exactly on time, as expected of someone raised to understand the importance of appearances. Seraphine Cole stepped through the tall doors in a gown of pale silver, her dark hair swept into an elegant crown of braids, her expression composed into the practiced calm of someone who had trained her entire life for this exact moment. Applause rippled through the hall, polite and measured, the kind reserved for political occasions rather than genuine celebration. Alira stood near the side wall, with a tray balanced against her hip, watching the procession with quiet curiosity. Seraphine was beautiful in the way marble statues are beautiful, flawless and cold, admired from a distance but never quite warm enough to invite closeness. She walked down the aisle with practiced grace, her eyes fixed straight ahead, never once glancing toward the man she was about to marry. Draven stood at the front of the hall beside the ceremonial arch, his posture perfectly straight, his expression unreadable. To anyone watching, he appeared every bit the composed ruler fulfilling his duty. Only someone standing close enough, someone paying careful attention, might have noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his hands remained clasped a little too tightly behind his back. Alira noticed. She wasn't sure why she kept watching him, but she did, and what she saw troubled her more than she wanted to admit. This was not a man in love. This was a man enduring something. The ceremony began with the traditional words spoken by an elder from the Shadowpine Council, a tall man named Edmund Clark, whose voice carried the weight of formality across the silent hall. He spoke of unity between territories, of peace secured through partnership, of two houses joined not by chance but by necessary alliance. Not once did he mention love. Not once did anyone in the hall seem to expect it. Illyra found herself wondering what it must feel like to marry someone for reasons that had nothing to do with affection. She thought of her grandmother, who often spoke about Illyra's grandfather with a softness in her voice that no political arrangement could ever manufacture. Real love, her grandmother always said, chooses you before you choose it back. She wondered if Draven Ashcombe had ever been given the chance to feel that kind of choice, or if his entire life had been decided for him from the moment he was born into power. As the ceremony continued, Illyra was called back to the kitchen to help prepare the next round of refreshments. She welcomed the distraction, grateful for a reason to step away from the strange tension that had been building inside her all morning. The kitchen was loud and chaotic, filled with the clatter of trays and the shouted instructions of chefs racing against time. She lost herself in the rhythm of work, chopping garnishes, arranging pastries, carrying trays back and forth through the service corridor. It was during one of these trips that she nearly collided with someone stepping quickly around the corner. "Careful," said a deep voice, strong hands catching her shoulders before the tray in her hands could spill. Illyra looked up and found herself standing far too close to Draven, who had apparently slipped away from his own ceremony for reasons she could not immediately understand. His hands lingered on her shoulders a moment longer than necessary before he released her, stepping back with visible effort. "Your Highness," she said quickly, straightening the tray. "Shouldn't you be at the front of the hall?" "I needed air," he said simply, though his eyes told a different story, one filled with something closer to desperation than discomfort. "The ceremony isn't finished," Illyra reminded him gently, unsure why she felt compelled to guide a king back toward his own wedding. "I'm aware." His gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Tell me something. Do you have family nearby? Someone who once ran a small business, perhaps a bakery?" The question startled her. "My grandmother owns a small bakery, yes. Why do you ask?" Something flickered across his face, quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "No reason," he said finally. "Forgive me. I should return." He turned to leave, but Illyra, driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, spoke before she could stop herself. "Your Highness, are you well? You don't seem like a man about to marry the woman he loves." The words left her mouth before she could weigh their wisdom, and she immediately regretted them, bracing for anger or reprimand. Instead, Draven turned back slowly, studying her with an expression that looked almost relieved, as though someone had finally said aloud what everyone else refused to acknowledge. "No," he admitted quietly, "I am not." Before Illyra could respond, footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, and Seraphine herself appeared, her silver gown trailing behind her, her expression sharp with suspicion. "Draven," she said coolly, her eyes flicking between him and Illyra. "The council is waiting. Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Draven replied, his voice returning instantly to its practiced calm. "I was simply asking for water." Seraphine's gaze lingered on Illyra for a long moment, cold and assessing, before she turned back to Draven. "Then let us return. Our guests grow impatient." She took his arm, guiding him back toward the hall, though not before glancing once more over her shoulder at Illyra, her expression unreadable but unmistakably wary. Illyra remained frozen in the corridor, her tray trembling slightly in her hands, her mind racing through everything that had just happened. Why had he asked about her grandmother? Why had he looked at her as though searching for a memory buried too deep to reach? And why did she feel, against all logic, that she recognized something in him too, something warm and distant, like a dream she couldn't quite recall upon waking? Nora found her a few minutes later, still standing in the same spot. "There you are," she said, concern etched across her face. "You disappeared for ages. What happened?" "I'm not sure," Illyra admitted honestly. "Something strange is happening, Nora, and I don't understand it." Nora studied her carefully, then glanced toward the hall where the ceremony continued. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "be careful. Kings do not simply notice servers without reason, and reasons like that rarely end simply." Illyra nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had begun the moment Draven first looked at her that morning was far too powerful to be stopped by caution alone. The ceremony resumed, and the guests settled back into respectful silence as the council elder continued the traditional vows. Illyra returned to her duties, carrying trays through the hall, refilling glasses, adjusting flowers, yet no matter how hard she tried to focus, Her attention kept drifting toward the front of the room, toward the king who stood beside his intended bride, with the weight of an entire territory resting on his shoulders, and toward the strange, unspoken pull that seemed to stretch between them, like an invisible thread neither of them had chosen to weave. As the afternoon sun shifted higher in the sky, casting warm light across the marble floor, Illyra could not shake the growing certainty that whatever was happening between her and Draven Ashcombe was only the beginning of something far larger than either of them yet understood, something rooted not in politics or duty, but in a connection neither time nor forgetting could fully erase. The afternoon light had grown warmer by the time Illyra found herself assigned to the smaller garden terrace, where a select group of elder guests preferred to sit away from the noise of the main hall. She carried a fresh pitcher of juice across the stone path, weaving between white chairs draped in ribbons, when she noticed an old woman sitting alone at the edge of the terrace, watching the distant hills with a thoughtful expression. The woman's name, Illyra would later learn, was Winifred Hollis, a retired advisor who had served the Ashcombe family for decades before stepping back from public duties. She waved Illyra over with a gentle hand. "You there, dear. Come sit for a moment, if your work allows it." Illyra hesitated, glancing toward the hall to make sure no one from management was watching. "I should keep working, ma'am." "Nonsense. An old woman gets lonely at these events. Humor me for 5 minutes." Winifred patted the chair beside her, and something about her warm, unhurried manner reminded Illyra so strongly of her own grandmother that she found herself sitting down before she could think better of it. "You have a curious face," Winifred said, studying her closely. "I have seen many faces pass through this estate over the years, but yours stirs something familiar in me. Have you been here before?" "No, ma'am. This is my first time working an Ashcombe event." "Strange," Winifred murmured, more to herself than to Illyra. "The Alpha King has not stopped glancing toward this terrace since the ceremony resumed. I assumed he was searching for someone important. Perhaps I was wrong. Or perhaps I was exactly right." Illyra's cheeks warmed, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "I'm sure he was simply checking on his guests." Winifred smiled knowingly, but did not press further. Instead, she gestured toward a faded photograph tucked into a small locket resting against her chest. "Do you know, dear, many years ago, this family faced a terrible attack from a rival territory. The young prince, barely more than a boy at the time, was gravely wounded and separated from his guards during the chaos. He vanished for 3 days. When he finally returned, he refused to speak of where he had gone or who had helped him. All he ever said was that a kind stranger with flour on her hands had saved his life." Illyra's breath caught in her throat, though she wasn't sure why. Flour on her hands? Yes. Winifred's eyes sharpened, studying her with new interest. "A baker's daughter," he once said, though he never gave a name. He searched for her for years afterward, quietly, without much success. Eventually, everyone assumed he had given up the search when his father arranged this marriage. The memory stirred again at the edge of Illyra's mind, faint and distant, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. A cold night, her grandmother's small kitchen, a wounded traveler collapsing through the back door, feverish and afraid, refusing to reveal his name. She had been young, barely more than a child herself, yet she remembered bandaging his shoulder with trembling hands, while her grandmother prepared warm broth. "I need to return to my duties," Illyra said suddenly, standing so quickly that her chair scraped against the stone. Winifred did not stop her, though her knowing smile lingered long after Illyra had hurried back toward the main hall, her heart pounding with a memory she could no longer push aside. She found Nora near the kitchen entrance, arranging dessert trays for the next course. "Nora," Illyra said, her voice unsteady, "I need to ask you something strange." "What is it?" "When I was young, maybe 12 or 13, a traveler came to my grandmother's bakery late at night. He was injured, feverish, and refused to say who he was. My grandmother and I helped him for 3 days before he disappeared before dawn. I always assumed he was simply a lost merchant." Nora frowned, setting down the tray. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Winifred Hollis just told me a story about the young Alpha King disappearing for 3 days after an attack, and how he was saved by a baker's daughter with flour on her hands." Illyra's voice trembled. "Nora, what if it was him? What if the traveler in my grandmother's kitchen all those years ago was Draven Ashcombe?" Nora's eyes widened, and for a long moment she said nothing, clearly turning the possibility over in her mind. "That would explain everything," she finally whispered. "The way he keeps watching you, the way he asked about your grandmother's bakery. Illyra, if this is true, you may be the one person he has been searching for since he was a boy." Before Illyra could respond, a commotion near the main hall drew their attention. Guests were gathering near the grand doors, murmuring excitedly as musicians began preparing for the next portion of the ceremony. The formal vows would begin soon, followed by the exchange of rings. Elira's stomach twisted painfully. If her suspicion was true, if she truly was the girl Draven Ashcombe had spent years searching for, then this entire wedding, this entire union built on political necessity, was about to unfold in front of the one person capable of shattering it completely, whether either of them intended it or not. She hurried back into the hall to resume her duties, her hands trembling as she arranged the final centerpieces along the head table. She tried desperately to convince herself that even if her suspicion was correct, it changed nothing. Kings married for duty, not memory. Whatever connection may have existed between them years ago meant little against the weight of political alliance now resting on his shoulders. Yet even as she told herself this, she could not stop glancing toward the front of the hall, where Draven stood beside Seraphine, his expression tight with something far heavier than nerves. As if sensing her thoughts from across the room, Draven turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers instantly among the crowd of guests and staff. For a brief moment, something passed between them, silent and unmistakable, a recognition neither of them had spoken aloud but both now understood. He remembered. And from the look on his face, Elira realized with startling clarity that he had never truly stopped searching for the girl who once saved his life, in a small, forgotten bakery, long before either of them understood what that single act of kindness would come to mean. The musicians began to play, signaling the final approach of the ceremony's most important moment, and Elira felt the weight of an impossible truth settling heavily over the golden afternoon light filling the grand hall. Years earlier, on a night thick with storm clouds and driving rain, a much younger Draven Ashcombe had stumbled through the back door of a small bakery on the edge of a quiet village, his shoulder torn and bleeding, his strength nearly gone. He had been separated from his guards during a sudden attack from a rival territory, forced to flee alone through unfamiliar forest paths, uncertain whether he would survive the night. He remembered collapsing against the wooden counter, the smell of fresh bread and warm cinnamon filling his senses even as darkness threatened to swallow his vision. A young girl, no older than 12, had rushed forward without hesitation, her hands dusted white with flour, her eyes wide with alarm but steady with determination. "Grandmother," she had called out, "someone is hurt." An older woman appeared moments later, quickly assessing his wound with practiced calm, directing her granddaughter to fetch clean cloth and warm water. Draven, weak from blood loss and fear, had tried to explain that he could not stay, that his identity had to remain hidden, that revealing himself could bring danger to their household. Yet the girl had simply pressed a cloth against his wound and told him firmly that talking would only make him bleed faster. He remembered her voice most clearly, calm and unafraid, despite the chaos surrounding him, guiding him through those first terrifying hours with a gentleness he had never before experienced from anyone outside his own family. Growing up as the future Alpha King, Draven had been surrounded by guards, advisors, and servants who treated him with careful distance, always aware of his position, always cautious never to overstep boundaries. This girl treated him simply as a person who needed help, nothing more, nothing less. Over the following 3 days, hidden in the small storage room above the bakery, Draven slowly regained his strength under the quiet care of the girl and her grandmother. He learned her name was Elira, though he never revealed his own identity, choosing instead to call himself a traveling merchant separated from his caravan. She never pressed him for more information than he was willing to give, respecting his privacy even as curiosity clearly lingered behind her careful eyes. On the third night, as his strength finally returned enough to continue his journey home, Draven had sat with her at the small kitchen table, sharing a simple meal of bread and soup by candlelight. "You never asked who I truly am," he said quietly, watching her carefully. Elira had shrugged, dipping her spoon into the broth. "You'll tell me if you want to, or you won't. Either way, you needed help, and I wasn't about to let someone die on our kitchen floor over a secret." Her simple honesty had struck him more deeply than any formal speech from his advisors ever had. He remembered thinking, even then, young as he was, that he had never met anyone quite like her, someone entirely unconcerned with power or position, someone who offered kindness simply because it was the right thing to do. Before dawn broke on the 4th day, Draven slipped away while the household still slept, leaving behind a small pouch of coins tucked beneath the loaf of bread cooling on the counter, along with a note thanking them for their kindness, though he signed it only with an unfamiliar initial to protect his identity. He returned home to a world of relief and celebration, his guards overjoyed to find him alive, his father demanding a full account of his disappearance. Draven told them only that a kind family had sheltered him, refusing to reveal further details, unwilling to expose the girl and her grandmother to the scrutiny and danger that often followed royal attention. Yet he never forgot her. Throughout his teenage years, as his training intensified and his responsibilities grew heavier, memories of that small bakery and the girl who had cared for him without hesitation lingered stubbornly in his mind. He often wondered what had become of her, whether she remembered him at all, whether fate would ever grant him the chance to properly thank her. As he grew older and assumed greater responsibilities within the Shadowpine Council, quiet inquiries were made, discreet searches conducted through various villages, yet the trail always grew cold. Bakeries opened and closed, families moved, and the girl who had once saved his life seemed to have vanished entirely from the world he now inhabited. Eventually, as political pressures mounted and the necessity for an alliance with the Cole family became unavoidable, Draven allowed himself to believe that perhaps some memories were simply meant to remain memories, beautiful but ultimately unreachable, never meant to shape the course of his adult life. He agreed to the marriage with Seraphine Cole not out of affection, but out of duty, understanding the political necessity required to secure peace between two long feuding territories. He told himself, repeatedly, that personal desires mattered little when weighed against the safety and stability of his entire territory. Yet nothing could have prepared him for the moment he stepped into his own wedding hall and found himself staring directly into the eyes of the very girl he had spent years quietly searching for, now grown into a woman whose gentle strength radiated just as clearly as it had all those years ago in a small, forgotten bakery. The realization had struck him like a physical blow, shaking the careful composure he had spent years perfecting. Every instinct within him, every quiet hope he had long buried beneath duty and responsibility, surged forward with overwhelming force the moment their eyes met. He told himself throughout the day that it was simply coincidence, that fate could not possibly be so cruel as to reunite him with her on this particular day, of all days. Yet the more he watched her move gracefully through the hall, calm and unaware of the storm brewing quietly within him, the more he understood that fate rarely cared about convenient timing. Now, standing at the front of his own wedding, moments away from exchanging vows with a woman he did not love, Draven felt the weight of his past colliding violently with the responsibilities of his present, and he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he could no longer pretend the connection between himself and Alira meant nothing at all. The vows had not yet been spoken, but tension inside the grand hall had grown thick enough to feel against the skin. Alira busied herself refilling glasses along the guest tables, forcing her hands steady despite the storm building quietly inside her chest. She kept replaying Winifred's story, kept picturing the wounded traveler from her childhood, kept comparing his features to the man now standing rigid at the front of the hall, and each time, the resemblance felt undeniable. She told herself repeatedly that even if her suspicion was true, it changed nothing practical. He was a king, she was a server. Whatever memory connected them belonged to childhood, not to the complicated realities of adulthood and duty. Yet Draven seemed unable to accept that same logic. Throughout the following hour, as guests mingled and photographers captured formal portraits near the ceremonial arch, Draven found excuse after excuse to remain near the serving staff. He requested water refills himself rather than summoning an attendant. He wandered toward the kitchen corridor under the pretense of checking on preparations for the reception meal. Each time his path crossed Alira's, and each time, the air between them seemed to hum with unspoken tension. Seraphine noticed. She watched from across the hall with narrowing eyes, as Draven once again drifted toward the service area. His attention clearly divided despite his attempts to appear composed. She excused herself from a conversation with visiting council members, and moved swiftly to intercept him near the kitchen entrance. "Draven," she said, her voice low but sharp, "you have visited the kitchen corridor no fewer than 4 times this hour. Is something wrong with the refreshments, or is something else drawing your attention?" Draven's jaw tightened. "I am simply ensuring the reception proceeds smoothly." "Are you?" Seraphine's eyes flicked briefly toward Alira, who stood several steps away, pretending not to overhear while arranging napkins with unnecessary precision. "Forgive me if I seem suspicious, but today of all days, I expect your full attention." "You have it," Draven replied evenly, though the tightness in his voice betrayed the effort required to maintain his composure. Seraphine studied him a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, before allowing the matter to drop for the sake of appearances. She returned to the main hall, though not without one final calculating glance toward Alira, a look that promised the conversation was far from finished. Once Seraphine had gone, Draven exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair in visible frustration. Alira set down the napkins and approached him cautiously. "You should return to your guests," she said quietly. "People are starting to notice." "I know," he admitted, his voice low and strained, I am trying, Alira. Believe me, I am trying to focus on my responsibilities today. But every time I look at you, I feel as though the ground beneath me has shifted, and I cannot explain why." Alira's breath caught at the sound of her own name spoken so intimately from his lips. "Perhaps," she said carefully. "It's simply the pressure of the day affecting your judgment. Weddings carry heavy expectations." "That isn't it." Draven shook his head firmly. "I have felt this pull since the moment I saw you this morning, long before any pressure from today's ceremony could explain it. Tell me honestly, do you feel nothing at all when you look at me?" Alira hesitated, her heart pounding painfully against her ribs. She wanted to deny it, wanted to insist that whatever tension existed between them meant nothing beyond simple coincidence. Yet the words refused to form, caught somewhere between honesty and self-preservation. "I don't know what I feel," she admitted finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But whatever it is, Your Highness, it doesn't matter. You are about to marry another woman. Nothing that happens between us today can change that reality." Draven studied her for a long, silent moment, his expression torn between duty and something far more powerful stirring beneath the surface. "Perhaps you're right," he said quietly, though his tone suggested he did not fully believe his own words. Before either of them could say more, a sudden commotion drew their attention back toward the main hall. Guests had begun gathering more tightly near the ceremonial arch, signaling that the final portion of the ceremony was about to begin. The exchange of vows could not be delayed any longer. Draven's expression hardened into practiced composure once again, though his eyes lingered on Alira a moment longer before he turned and walked back toward the hall, his steps heavy with the weight of a decision he had not yet allowed himself to fully consider. Alira remained standing near the kitchen entrance, her hands trembling slightly as she watched him go. Nora appeared beside her moments later, her expression grave. "This is becoming dangerous," Nora said quietly. "Seraphine already suspects something. If the council believes the Alpha King's attention has been compromised by a member of the serving staff, the consequences could be severe, not just for him, but for you as well." "I know," Alira whispered, guilt twisting painfully in her stomach. "I never intended any of this, Nora. I only came here to earn wages for my grandmother's medicine." "I believe you," Nora said gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "But intentions rarely matter once fate has already set events into motion. Whatever is happening between you and the Alpha King, it appears far too powerful to simply ignore." Alira nodded silently, her gaze drifting once more toward the main hall, where Draven now stood beside Seraphine, preparing to exchange the vows that would bind him to a woman he clearly did not love, while the memory of a small bakery and a wounded traveler continued pulling at something deep within both their hearts. As the ceremony resumed and the elder council member began reciting the traditional words of union, Alira felt a heavy certainty settle over her, one she could no longer deny. Whatever force had brought Draven Ashcombe back into her life today, it was far too strong to remain hidden much longer, and the coming hours would demand a reckoning neither of them could avoid. The formal exchange of vows had been postponed until after the afternoon banquet, a tradition among the Shadowpine Council meant to allow guests time to feast and celebrate before the binding words were spoken at sunset. Alira found herself grateful for the delay, though the growing tension inside her offered little relief regardless of the schedule. The banquet hall buzzed with lively conversation as course after course was served, each dish more elaborate than the last. Alira moved between tables with practiced efficiency, though her attention remained divided, constantly aware of Draven's presence at the head table, seated stiffly beside Seraphine, his expression carefully neutral despite the storm she now understood, raged quietly beneath his composed exterior. Seraphine, for her part, appeared determined to reclaim his attention. She leaned close throughout the meal, engaging him in conversation, resting her hand deliberately atop his whenever photographers approached to capture candid moments. Yet even as Draven responded appropriately, offering polite smiles and measured words, Alira noticed the subtle stiffness in his posture, the way his eyes occasionally drifted across the hall despite his obvious effort to remain focused. Near the middle of the banquet, Alira was summoned to the head table to refill the wine glasses of the council elders seated closest to the royal couple. Her hands remained steady as she moved carefully around the table, pouring wine with practiced precision, though her heart raced the closer she came to Draven's seat. As she reached his glass, their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them, silent yet unmistakably powerful. She poured the wine quickly, determined not to linger, yet as she straightened to move away, Draven's hand brushed against hers, seemingly by accident, though the contact lingered a fraction longer than necessary. A visible shiver ran through him, his shoulders tensing sharply, his breath catching audibly enough that Seraphine noticed immediately. "Draven," she said sharply, her voice carrying just enough irritation to draw attention from nearby guests. "Are you unwell?" "I'm fine," he replied quickly, though his voice sounded strained, almost pained. Alira quickly retreated from the table, her own pulse racing from the brief contact, though she had no explanation for the intensity of the reaction she had witnessed in him. She hurried back toward the kitchen, desperate for a moment to steady herself. Nora found her moments later, concern etched clearly across her face. "What happened? You look pale." "I don't know," Alira admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I touched his hand while pouring wine, completely by accident, and he reacted as though I had struck him with lightning." Nora's eyes widened with sudden understanding, though she quickly masked her expression, glancing around to ensure no one else had overheard. "Elira," she whispered urgently, pulling her further into the kitchen away from prying ears. "Have you ever heard the old stories about fated bonds among the pack leaders?" "Fated bonds?" Elira frowned, confusion evident on her face. "I've heard old legends, nothing more." "Surely you don't believe such things are real." "I didn't, until now," Nora admitted quietly. "The stories say that certain individuals are destined by nature itself to be paired together, a connection so powerful it cannot be denied or ignored, regardless of duty or circumstance. Reactions like the one you just described, sudden intensity, physical awareness, and inability to look away, these are the signs the old stories describe." Alira shook her head firmly, refusing to entertain such an impossible idea. "That's nothing more than folklore, Nora. I'm a server, not someone fated to be paired with an alpha king." Yet even as she spoke the words, doubt lingered stubbornly in her mind, refusing to be dismissed entirely. Meanwhile, back at the head table, Seraphine's suspicion had hardened into quiet determination. She excused herself briefly from the banquet, moving swiftly toward Draven's private study down a nearby corridor, where she found him standing alone, pressing his palms flat against his desk, breathing heavily as though fighting to regain control over something powerful. "Draven," she said firmly, closing the door behind her. "I demand to know what is happening. You have not been yourself all day, and I refuse to be humiliated in front of the entire council because of whatever this is." He straightened slowly, forcing his expression back into practiced calm, though his eyes remained troubled. "I apologize, Seraphine. The pressures of today have simply overwhelmed me more than expected. Do not insult my intelligence." Her voice sharpened further. "I have watched you today, Draven. I have seen where your attention keeps drifting. If there is something happening between you and one of the serving staff, I deserve to know before we exchange vows this evening, not after." Draven's jaw tightened, torn between honesty and the political necessity of maintaining their fragile alliance. "There is nothing occurring that should concern you," he said finally, though the words felt hollow even to himself. Seraphine studied him a long moment, clearly unconvinced, before turning sharply toward the door. "For your sake, Draven, I hope that remains true. Because if I discover otherwise, the consequences will extend far beyond simple embarrassment." She left the study without waiting for a response, her heels echoing sharply against the marble floor. Alone once more, Draven sank into the chair behind his desk, pressing his fingers against his temples in frustration. He could feel it building within him, an instinct far older and more powerful than personal preference or political duty, an undeniable pull drawing him toward Alira with an intensity he could no longer suppress through willpower alone. He understood now, with growing certainty, that whatever connection bound him to her was not simply nostalgia from a childhood memory. It was something deeper, something rooted in the very nature of his identity as Alpha King, a bond the old legends had long warned could not be ignored without consequence. As the banquet continued outside his study, laughter and conversation drifting faintly through the closed door, Draven remained seated in troubled silence, understanding with dawning clarity that the sun would set on this day carrying consequences far greater than anyone currently gathered in that grand hall could possibly anticipate. The banquet drew toward its close as servers cleared the final course, and attendants began preparing the hall for the closing toast that traditionally preceded the formal exchange of vows. Elira moved through the room gathering empty plates, her mind still unsettled from Nora's words about fated bonds, though she continued to dismiss the idea as impossible folklore, unwilling to accept something so far beyond her understanding. Draven returned from his study looking composed once more, though anyone who studied him closely might have noticed the tightness around his eyes, the careful control evident in every measured breath he took. He resumed his seat beside Seraphine, offering polite responses to the well wishes of nearby guests, though his attention remained fractured despite his best efforts. As the final course was cleared, Edmund Clark rose from his seat at the head table, lifting a crystal glass to signal the beginning of the closing toast. The hall quieted respectfully as he began his formal address, praising the union between the two territories, speaking eloquently of peace secured through partnership and strength renewed through unity. Elira stood near the side wall, a tray balanced against her hip, watching the proceedings with a strange sense of dread building steadily within her chest. She glanced toward Draven and found him already watching her, his expression tight with visible strain, as though something inside him was fighting desperately against restraint. As Edmund continued his toast, gesturing warmly toward the couple, Draven's breathing grew increasingly shallow. His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles whitening with effort, sweat beading faintly along his brow despite the cool evening air drifting through the open terrace doors. Seraphine noticed immediately, leaning close with visible alarm. "Draven, what is wrong with you?" He did not answer, his gaze locked helplessly across the room toward Elira, his entire body trembling with the effort of suppressing something far too powerful to contain much longer. Elira felt it too, a sudden overwhelming pull unlike anything she had ever experienced, as though invisible threads connecting her chest to his were tightening with unbearable intensity. Her tray slipped from her fingers, crashing loudly against the floor, drawing startled gasps from nearby guests. The sound seemed to break whatever remaining control Draven had maintained. His eyes flashed suddenly with an unnatural golden light, visible even from across the crowded hall, and a low sound rumbled from deep within his chest, barely human, filled with primal urgency. Gasps rippled through the guests as they witnessed the unmistakable sign long spoken of only in ancient legends among their people, the awakening of a true and undeniable mate bond. "Draven," Seraphine's voice cracked with disbelief and rising fury as she stared at him, understanding dawning rapidly across her features. "What is happening?" He did not immediately respond, his entire focus consumed by the overwhelming instinct now surging through him, demanding recognition, demanding acknowledgement of the bond that had clearly existed dormant within him since childhood, now fully awakened by proximity and undeniable fate. Council members rose from their seats, murmuring urgently among themselves, understanding the significance of what they were witnessing, far better than the common guests scattered throughout the hall. Ancient pack law held that a true mate bond, once fully awakened and confirmed before witnesses, could not be denied or suppressed without causing severe and lasting harm to both individuals involved. Elira remained frozen near the side wall, her heart pounding violently, overwhelmed by sensations she could not fully comprehend, yet undeniable in their intensity. She understood now, with startling clarity, that whatever connection she had felt toward Draven since that very morning was not simple coincidence or nostalgia. It was exactly what the old legends described, a fated bond too powerful to ignore. Draven rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate despite the visible tremor still running through his frame. His eyes, still tinged with unnatural gold, remained locked on Elira across the crowded hall, filled with a mixture of wonder, fear, and overwhelming certainty. "Draven, sit down immediately," Seraphine hissed urgently, grabbing his sleeve. "Whatever this is, we can address it privately after the ceremony concludes." But Draven gently pulled his arm free, his gaze never leaving Elira. "I cannot deny this any longer, Seraphine. I am sorry, but I cannot." Murmurs erupted throughout the hall as guests began whispering urgently among themselves, understanding rapidly, spreading that something extraordinary and irreversible was unfolding before their very eyes. Photographers lowered their cameras uncertainly, unsure whether to continue capturing the moment or retreat entirely from the escalating tension. Edmund Clark stepped forward hesitantly, clearing his throat. "Your Highness, perhaps we should adjourn briefly to allow tempers to settle before proceeding further." "No," Draven said firmly, his voice carrying newfound clarity, despite the storm still visibly raging within him. "I have spent years searching for an answer to a question I barely understood myself. That answer stands before me now, undeniable, and impossible to ignore any longer. I owe it to everyone gathered here, and to myself, to face this truth honestly, rather than continuing to hide from it." He turned fully away from Seraphine, walking slowly across the hall toward Elira, his steps steady despite the shocked silence surrounding him. Guests parted instinctively to allow his passage, whispers rising into a low, urgent hum as everyone present began to understand the magnitude of what was unfolding. Elira remained rooted in place, unable to move, her heart hammering violently as Draven approached, stopping only a few steps away, his golden eyes searching hers with desperate intensity. "Elira," he said quietly, though his voice carried clearly across the silent hall, I believe fate has finally answered a question I have carried since childhood, one I never truly abandoned, no matter how many years passed. The entire hall held its breath, waiting, watching, as the sun outside began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden light across the marble floor, illuminating a moment neither Alira nor Draven, nor anyone gathered within that grand hall, would ever forget. The silence stretching through the grand hall felt heavier than any words could have been. Alira stood frozen before Draven, acutely aware of hundreds of eyes fixed upon them, waiting to see what would happen next. Seraphine remained seated at the head table, her expression a mixture of shock, humiliation, and rising fury, while her father, Victor Lane, rose sharply from his own seat among the visiting council members, his face darkening with barely restrained anger. Draven Ashcombe, Victor's voice boomed across the hall, cutting through the tense silence. Explain yourself immediately. This alliance was agreed upon by both our territories after months of careful negotiation. You cannot simply abandon it because of some sudden delusion. Draven turned slowly to face him, his expression calm despite the visible strain still evident in his posture. This is not a delusion, Victor. What you witnessed moments ago was the awakening of a true mate bond, recognized by ancient law long before either of our territories existed in their current form. Ancient law does not override present agreements, Victor snapped, stepping forward angrily. Your father secured this alliance to end decades of conflict between our people. Are you prepared to throw away years of peace for the sake of a serving girl? The word landed harshly across the hall, and Alira felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, though she refused to lower her gaze despite the weight of judgment pressing down upon her from every direction. She is not merely a serving girl, Draven replied firmly, his voice carrying newfound authority despite the personal turmoil clearly still affecting him. She saved my life when I was a boy, asking for nothing in return. Fate has now confirmed what I have long suspected, that she is my true and rightful mate, recognized by the very laws our people have upheld for generations. Edmund Clark stepped forward cautiously, raising his hands in a gesture meant to calm the escalating tension. Perhaps we should retire to a private chamber to discuss this matter more calmly, away from the eyes of our guests. No, Draven said firmly, shaking his head. I have spent too many years hiding behind duty and expectation, denying instincts I did not fully understand until today. I will not compound that mistake by hiding this truth now, in front of the very people whose trust and respect I hope to earn honestly moving forward. Seraphine finally rose from her seat, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. So that is your decision then? To humiliate me in front of my own family and yours, abandoning our agreement entirely, simply because of some ancient superstition you claim has suddenly awakened? Seraphine, Draven said gently, turning toward her with genuine remorse evident in his expression. I never intended to cause you pain. Our arrangement was built on political necessity, not affection, and I believe you deserve a partner capable of offering you genuine devotion, something I now understand I could never fully provide, regardless of duty. Seraphine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, though her expression hardened quickly into cold determination. You may believe you are following some noble truth, Draven, but you have made a powerful enemy today, one whose family will not easily forget this humiliation. She turned sharply, gathering her silver gown and storming from the hall, her father following closely behind, his expression thunderous with barely restrained fury. Several guests aligned with the Cole family rose quickly to follow, murmuring urgently among themselves as they departed, leaving visible gaps scattered throughout the once crowded hall. Alira watched the chaos unfold around her, overwhelmed by guilt despite understanding logically that she had done nothing intentional to cause this disruption. She turned toward Draven, her voice barely above a whisper.
Perhaps I should leave. This is clearly a private matter for your council to resolve.
No, Draven said quickly, reaching for her hand before catching himself and lowering his arm instead, mindful of the many eyes still watching closely. Please, Alira, whatever happens next, I need you to remain. This concerns you as much as it concerns me. Winifred Hollis, who had been observing quietly from her seat near the terrace doors, rose slowly and approached the center of the hall, her expression calm, despite the surrounding chaos. If I may speak, she said, her voice carrying clearly despite her age. I have served this family for many decades, long enough to witness the rare occurrence of true mate bonds firsthand. What we witnessed today was unmistakable, and ancient law is clear on this matter. A confirmed mate bond, recognized before credible witnesses, cannot be reasonably denied without significant harm to both parties involved. Edmund Clark nodded reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable but unable to dispute Winifred's authority on the matter. She speaks the truth. Pack law does recognize such bonds as taking precedence over political agreements, though the consequences of enforcing that law today will undoubtedly prove complicated. Murmurs rippled through the remaining guests, some nodding in cautious understanding, others exchanging worried glances, clearly concerned about the political fallout certain to follow such a dramatic disruption to carefully negotiated peace. Draven turned back toward Alira, his expression softening despite the surrounding tension. I understand this is overwhelming, and I understand you never asked for any of this to happen, but I cannot ignore what fate has revealed today, nor do I wish to. Will you allow me the chance to explain everything properly, away from the chaos of this hall? Alira hesitated, overwhelmed by the sudden shift her simple job had taken, yet unable to deny the undeniable pull she now recognized within herself as well. Yes, she said finally, her voice steadier than she expected. I think we both deserve answers. As the remaining guests watched in stunned silence, Draven extended his hand toward her, waiting patiently rather than assuming, allowing her the choice rather than the certainty. Slowly, Alira reached forward and placed her hand in his, and the moment their fingers intertwined, a visible warmth seemed to settle over both of them, easing the tension that had gripped them throughout the long, chaotic day. Outside the tall windows of the grand hall, the sun continued its steady descent, painting the sky in deepening shades of orange and gold, marking the slow but unmistakable end of the wedding that had begun that morning, and the uncertain but undeniable beginning of something neither Alira nor Draven fully understood yet, but both now recognized as inevitable. Draven led Alira away from the chaos of the main hall, guiding her through a quiet side corridor toward the same private sitting room where they had spoken briefly earlier that morning. The noise of the dispersing wedding guests faded gradually behind them, replaced by a heavy, uncertain silence that settled comfortably between them despite the enormity of everything that had just occurred. Once inside, Draven closed the door gently and turned to face her, his expression a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. Thank you for staying, he said quietly. I know today has asked far more of you than any wage could reasonably cover. Alira managed a small, tired smile. I came here today expecting to serve appetizers and refill wine glasses, Your Highness. I never imagined I would leave having disrupted an entire political alliance. Please, he said gently, call me Draven. Titles feel unnecessary between us now, given everything that has transpired. She nodded slowly, studying him carefully. Winifred told me a story earlier today, about a young prince who disappeared for 3 days after an attack, saved by a baker's daughter with flour on her hands. I didn't want to believe it was you, but somehow, deep down, I think I always knew. Draven's expression softened further, memories clearly resurfacing behind his eyes. I never forgot you, Alira, even though I never learned your family name, even though years passed without any success in finding you again. I searched quietly whenever circumstances allowed, though I eventually convinced myself that perhaps some memories were simply meant to remain memories. And yet here we are, Alira said softly, glancing around the quiet room. I still don't fully understand what happened today. Nora mentioned old legends about fated bonds, but I always assumed such stories were simply folklore. They are very real, Draven said carefully. Among our people, certain bonds are recognized as unbreakable once fully confirmed. What happened today in the hall, the reaction you witnessed, was undeniable proof recognized by everyone present, including the council elders who understand pack law far better than either of us. Alira sat slowly onto a nearby chair, processing the weight of his words. This changes everything, doesn't it? Not just for you, but for your entire territory. Yes, Draven admitted honestly, sitting across from her. The alliance with the Cole family will undoubtedly suffer as a result of today's events. There may be difficult consequences ahead, tension between our territories that will require careful diplomacy to resolve. I will not pretend otherwise. Then why choose this path? Alira asked quietly. You could have suppressed whatever reaction occurred today. You could have continued with the ceremony despite everything. Draven shook his head firmly. I spent years honoring duty above personal desire, believing that sacrifice was simply part of the responsibility that came with my position. But today, standing before you, feeling that undeniable connection awaken fully within me, I understood clearly that continuing to deny it would have caused harm far greater than any political consequence, harm to myself, and eventually, harm to you as well, once the bond grew impossible to ignore. Alira considered his words carefully, understanding the depth of sacrifice and courage required for him to have acted as he did in front of hundreds of witnesses. I still don't know what my role is supposed to be in all of this, she admitted honestly. I'm not trained for politics or leadership. I'm simply a woman who grew up baking bread beside her grandmother. That is precisely why I believe fate chose you. Draven said gently. I have spent my entire life surrounded by advisors and council members who value strategy above sincerity. You showed me kindness without expectation of reward, honesty without calculation. Those qualities matter far more to me now than any political training could ever provide. A soft knock interrupted their conversation, and Edmund Clark entered cautiously, his expression grave but resigned. Your Highness, the council has convened to discuss the aftermath of today's events. While the situation remains complicated, ancient law is clear regarding confirmed mate bonds. The Cole family has departed in anger, though war remains unlikely given the broader benefits both territories still gain from maintaining peaceful relations, even without a formal marriage alliance. Draven nodded gravely. Thank you, Edmund. I understand further negotiations will be necessary in the coming weeks to repair what remains repairable. There is one more matter, Edmund continued carefully, glancing briefly toward Alira. The council will require formal confirmation of the bond, along with proper introduction of Miss Voss to the wider community, should you intend to proceed toward eventual union. Alira's eyes widened slightly at the implication, though Draven reached forward, gently taking her hand once more. Only if she chooses that path willingly, Edmund. I will not force expectations upon her simply because fate has revealed a bond between us. She deserves the freedom to decide her own future. Alira looked at him carefully, weighing the enormity of the choice now resting before her. Only hours earlier, she had been an anonymous server, worried only about earning enough wages to help her ailing grandmother. Now, she stood at the threshold of an entirely different life, one filled with responsibility, scrutiny, and undeniable connection to a man she was only beginning to understand. I need time, she said honestly, to process everything that has happened today. But I don't want to walk away from this either. Draven, whatever this bond means, I feel it too, and I don't think I could ignore it even if I tried. Draven's expression relaxed with visible relief, gratitude evident in his eyes. Take whatever time you need, Alira. I have waited years already, without fully understanding what I was waiting for. I can wait a little longer now that I finally understand. Edmund excused himself quietly, leaving the two of them alone once more in the fading evening light. Outside the window, the sun continued its final descent, casting long amber shadows across the quiet room, marking the symbolic close of a wedding that had ended far differently than anyone gathered that morning could have possibly predicted. 3 weeks passed following the collapse of the wedding, weeks filled with careful diplomacy, tense negotiations, and gradual healing between the Shadowpine territory and the Cole family. Victor Lane remained bitter over the public humiliation his daughter had endured, though calmer discussions eventually revealed that both territories still shared strong economic and defensive interests, encouraging a fragile but workable peace, even without a formal marriage binding the two houses together. Seraphine herself, though initially furious, gradually came to view the situation with unexpected clarity. In a private letter delivered to Draven shortly after her departure, she admitted that she too had never felt genuine affection toward their arranged union, and that perhaps fate had simply spared them both from a lifetime of quiet dissatisfaction. She requested only that the council handle the political fallout with discretion, a request Draven happily honored. Meanwhile, Alira returned to her grandmother's small bakery, uncertain how to process the whirlwind of events that had upended her simple life so completely. Margaret listened carefully as Alira recounted everything that had happened, her wise eyes softening with understanding rather than shock. I always wondered about that strange young man who once appeared at our door so many years ago, Margaret said thoughtfully, kneading dough at the familiar counter. Something about him felt different, important, though I never imagined the truth would reveal itself quite so dramatically. What should I do, grandmother? Alira asked, sitting wearily at the small kitchen table. This is not the life I ever imagined for myself. I don't know if I'm capable of becoming someone's queen. Margaret smiled gently, setting aside her work to sit across from her granddaughter. Capability is rarely something we possess before circumstances demand it, Alira. You showed courage and kindness the night you helped that wounded stranger, without any expectation of reward. Perhaps that same courage is exactly what fate believes you now need to embrace. Alira considered her grandmother's words carefully over the following days, torn between the comfortable simplicity of her old life and the undeniable connection she still felt toward Draven, a connection that had only grown stronger despite the physical distance between them. Draven, respecting her request for space, sent no demands, only occasional letters expressing patience and genuine care, allowing her the freedom to reach her own decision without pressure. His letters spoke honestly of his own uncertainties, his fears about becoming a fair and just leader, his hopes that whatever path she chose, she would do so because it felt right to her, not simply because fate had declared it so. Eventually, nearly a month after the disrupted wedding, Alira found herself standing once again at the gates of the Ashcombe estate, though this time, she arrived not as hired staff, but as an invited guest, her heart steady, despite the uncertainty still lingering within her. Draven met her personally at the entrance, his expression brightening with unmistakable relief and joy the moment he saw her approaching. "You came," he said softly, unable to fully hide his happiness. "I needed time to understand myself before understanding what this bond truly means," Alira admitted honestly. "But I've realized something important during these past few weeks. Whatever fear I carried about this new life, it pales in comparison to the connection I feel whenever I think of you, or of that night so many years ago, when a frightened traveler taught me that kindness matters more than any expectation placed upon us by others." Draven reached forward, gently taking her hands into his own. "I promise you, Alira, whatever challenges lie ahead, we will face them honestly, together, without pretense or hidden agendas. You saved my life once, without asking anything in return. Allow me the honor of spending the rest of my life ensuring you never regret choosing this path." Word spread quickly throughout the Shadowpine territory regarding the true story behind the Alpha King's cancelled wedding, the ancient bond rediscovered after years of separation, and the humble baker's granddaughter who had unknowingly captured his heart long before either of them understood the significance of that fateful night. Rather than scandal, the story gradually inspired genuine admiration among the people, who saw in Alira's simple kindness and quiet strength qualities they hoped to see reflected in their future queen. Months later, a formal ceremony was held, far simpler and more intimate than the elaborate wedding originally planned with Seraphine, filled instead with genuine warmth, laughter, and the presence of those who truly mattered most, including Margaret, who wept proudly as she watched her granddaughter step into a role she could scarcely have imagined years earlier, while running a small bakery in a quiet, forgotten village. As the sun set gently over the Shadowpine estate on their wedding day, casting the same warm golden light that had witnessed their fateful reunion months earlier, Draven turned to Alira, his expression filled with quiet wonder and profound gratitude. "From server to queen," he whispered softly, echoing the words already spreading throughout the territory as their story became legend among their people. Alira smiled warmly, resting her hand gently against his. "From forgotten memory to undeniable fate," she replied softly. "I suppose some bonds truly are meant to find their way home, no matter how many years or how much distance stands between them." And as darkness gently settled over the celebrating crowd below, the story of the humble server who had once caught the eye of an Alpha King during his own wedding day continued to inspire hope throughout the territory, a reminder that true fate, however delayed, however unexpected, always finds its rightful path home.